Okay. Good morning. Bonjour, Tanzi. I'm Independent Senator Marilou McPhedran, and I come from Treaty 1 territory and the homeland of the Métis Nation, Manitoba. I'm very honored to have with me today young Rohingya women advocates who are able to report in very personal terms about the ongoing genocidal violence against Rohingya in many parts of the world. Joining me today on my left is Yasmin Ullah, RMCN member, and Noor Azizah. Yasmin is from Canada, Noor is from Australia. And the RMCN is a vibrant and dedicated network of young Rohingya women committed to tackling urgent human rights and humanitarian concerns affecting the Rohingya people, amplifying the voices and agency of Rohingya women who have been enduring mass atrocities, including genocide and conflict-related sexual violence. The RMCN mission is to effect change in the Rohingya homeland of Rakhine in a democratic Myanmar, and to ensure respect for Rohingya displaced and refugees wherever they may be. The RMCN calls upon the Government of Canada urgently to support the Rohingya directly in this moment of extreme need, and we will hear much more of that from our speakers today. And in addition to Yasmin and Noor, I'm very honored to have with us experts from Inter Pares, Sam McGavin, and also from the University of Ottawa Law, Professor John Packer. And without further ado, I'm going to invite Yasmin to speak with you. Yasmin.
Thank you so much for joining us today to address the urgent escalating crisis facing the Rohingya community in Arakan or Rakhine State, Burma, Myanmar. My name is Yasmin Ullah, and I am a Rohingya Canadian human rights activist currently serving as the executive director of the Rohingya Maìyafuìnor Collaborative Network. I was born in Arakan State, Myanmar, during the height of the violence against Rohingya in the 1990s. Seeing no way out, my parents decided to flee from the country in 1995. We were displaced in Thailand without legal status or protection for 16 years before a group of kind Canadians stepped up to help us through a sponsored resettlement process. 14 years later, I am now one of the very few fortunate Rohingya who live in relative peace. Unfortunately, only 1% of the Rohingya out of 1.8 million people worldwide are currently living in freedom. Since May of this year, we have witnessed a horrifying escalation of violence against Rohingya people. Drone attacks, airstrikes, and the systematic burning of homes by both the Arakan army and the military junta have left approximately 95% of the Rohingya community displaced internally. This brutal campaign not only resulted in widespread suffering, but has also led to forced conscription of thousands of Rohingya men and boys who are coerced into becoming frontline fighters in a conflict that seeks to erase their very existence. One harrowing account of a Rohingya man captures the despair. Quote, "They use us as frontline fighters. They want to wipe us out. It's the AA, or the Arakan army, and Myanmar military's policy," unquote. This dark reality reveals how both the junta and the Arakan army are using our community as pawns for their goals, subjecting them to torture, abuse, and death. The consequences of this violence are dire, fostering a deepening divide and a culture of hatred that threatens the very fabric of our society in Burma, Myanmar. In a tragic twist, 25,000 Rohingya have fled from Mongdo and Buthidaung townships to Bangladesh Cox's Bazar area in the past month. Yet, they now find themselves without essential humanitarian support. Rohingya-led organizations such as ourselves have stepped in, providing emergency funds and food, while no other big humanitarian organizations have stepped in. These efforts, unfortunately, are insufficient to meet overwhelming needs of this vulnerable population, which consist very much of women and children. This violence marks what can only be described as a second wave of genocide against the Rohingya people. It underscores the urgent need for accountability in a country rife with ideological turmoil, where armed groups operate with impunity and civilians continue to bear the brunt of this conflict. Today, we call upon the Canadian government to take decisive actions. Our requests are as follows. 1. Leverage Canada's influence. Use your position to advocate for the National Unity Government to establish a working accountability mechanism that holds both the junta and the armed groups accountable for their crimes and end the culture of impunity. 2. End enablers of violence. Hold accountable not just the junta, but also its ASEAN enablers, both the government and private sectors, who continue to facilitate aviation fuel sales to the military used in deadly airstrikes and allow assets of genocide perpetrators to be stored within their national banking systems. 3. Support Rohingya initiatives. Provide direct support to the Rohingya refugee initiatives, particularly those led by women. Expand humanitarian programs beyond Bangladesh to ensure comprehensive aid reaches those in dire need. We implore the international community, especially Canada, to stand with the Rohingya in this time of unimaginable suffering. The world cannot afford to remain silent while atrocities unfold, and there is no future for a democratic Burma Myanmar without Rohingya in it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yasmin. I need to say that I was in Cox's Bazar with the Global Network of Women Peace Builders in 2019. And what I'm hearing today about the 25,000 Rohingya who have gone to Cox's Bazar in just the last month underscores the fact that back in 2019, soon after now Ambassador Bob Rae issued his report to the Canadian government that said, "Tell them we are human," we are now seeing more than 20,000 Rohingya people, many of them women and children, becoming and receiving the least of the least within the camps. I'd now like to welcome Noor Azizah, who has come to us from Australia to give her account. Noor.
Thank you so much. My name is Noor Azizah. I'm a proud Rohingya woman from Arakan, Burma, Myanmar. I was born in 1995, a time when waves of violence ravaged my people in our ancestral homeland. My family, my parents, 2 elder sisters, 2 elder brothers, and I was just a baby. We were forced to flee, driven by the escalating persecution of the Rohingya. My parents knew that staying meant risking their children's lives. There were no opportunities for us to thrive in Burma, Myanmar. Only the certainty that the violence would continue to worsen, which they predicted correctly. The decision to leave behind everything was one born of desperation and love. Their only choice was to protect us. Our journey across Southeast Asia was life-threatening. We walked through dense jungles, boarded any boat that would take us, survived on scraps of food, and relied on the generosity of host communities. We ended up in Sabah, Malaysia. I lived there as a refugee for the first 8 years and a half of my life. My family's story echoes the tragic journey of many Rohingya families that are fleeing the genocidal violence in Myanmar. In October 2003, our nightmare ended. The Australian government granted my family asylum. For the first time, we felt safe, I had rights, I was able to be recognised as a person with paper to prove it. Today, I'm the co-founder of the Rohingya Maìyafuìnor Collaborative Network. As we speak right now, Rohingya fleeing genocide face mounting hostility across the ASEAN region, fueled by misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech that is manifesting into physical violence. In recent months, I have personally visited my Rohingya brothers and sisters in Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia, witnessing their first-hand anxiety and fear. A boat carrying Rohingya refugees in Aceh was turned away this year. A Rohingya mother fleeing with 2 children told the BBC how one of her children died on starvation on the boat. She had no choice but to bury her child by casting the body to the sea. In Malaysia, over 1,500 Rohingya children are being detained in appalling conditions. These facilities are deeply concerning, and yet they represent just one aspect of the trauma of our people. Recently, there has been an increased movement of Rohingya in Aceh, Indonesia. 75% are women and children fleeing. In March of last year, a boat captain deliberately capsized a vessel carrying 140 Rohingya, killing 67 people. The survivors, many of them women, had already experienced unimaginable horrors in Burma, Myanmar, including gender-based violence and rape at the hands of their captors. I am currently involved in helping 5 Rohingya women with gender-sensitive care who are now dealing with the trauma of childbirth after enduring genocidal rape in Burma and throughout Southeast Asia. Genocidal violence does not stop when fleeing Burma. It continues in Southeast Asia. We call on ASEAN leaders to be held accountable. The principle of non-interference cannot be used as an excuse to ignore the Rohingya genocide. This stance has paralyzed ASEAN from making timely and effective decisions, allowing genocidal violence to persist unchecked. It is time for a shift towards constructive engagement and non-indifference. Immediate, impactful action is needed to address the Rohingya genocide before more lives are lost.
Thank you, Noor, and I think it's important to note that every single one of the accountability mechanisms that were set out by Yasmin and Noor are within the scope of the Canadian federal government. What we lack is the political will to take the kind of action that we were taking 5 years ago, and it's time to change that. I'd now like to invite Sam McGavin of the civil society organization Inter Pares, an expert in this area. Sam.
Thank you, Senator McPhedran, for hosting us. It's an honor to be here alongside the deeply inspiring activists from RMCN. My organization, Inter Pares, has been working in solidarity with conflict-affected ethnic people, including Rohingya, from Myanmar since the early 1990s with the support of the Government of Canada. It's been over 3.5 years since a military coup ended a fragile and flawed experiment with democracy. But for the country's ethnic peoples, including the Rohingya, this current chapter of suffering is but the latest in a story of rights violations, atrocities, and military-controlled existence that stretches back decades. The current situation now is far from the headlines, but the scale and severity is dire. Beyond the numbers of 3.5 million displaced or 6 million children in need of assistance, the nature of suffering being inflicted upon everyday people is horrific, as we've heard. Beheadings, burned homes, forced recruitment, sexual violence, massive aerial bombardments against civilians. I could go on. The international community is doing little to stem this tide of horror. Canada has been one of the few countries playing a leadership role, but this is waning in the face of competing crises. It is time for Canada to renew its strategy to respond to the Rohingya and Myanmar crises. The legacy of the leadership offered by Ambassador Bob Rae during his term as Special Envoy must be continued. Centering gender equality and women's leadership in this strategy can also help Canada live out its commitments in its National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security, which should be energetically implemented. We must also ensure that Canadian companies cannot fund the military junta. The Myanmar Oil and Gas Enterprise, or MOGE, is the largest remaining source of income for the junta and is therefore a critical target to halting the flow of funds that allows the junta to commit atrocities against its own people. Targeted and coordinated global sanctions against high-impact targets are a key way to use our economic force as an international community. Our sanctions allies in the US and the EU have partially targeted MOGE in their sanctions, but our own otherwise robust sanctions regime has failed to sanction MOGE. This must change. Canada must sanction MOGE. We must also scale up our humanitarian response, given the scale of the crisis, while ensuring that our assistance does not shore up junta control. Cross-border assistance, which uses the safety and networks of neighboring countries to channel support into conflict-affected areas, working through trusted local civil society, is the only way to ensure that aid from countries like Canada does not go into the hands of the military regime or be used to shore up their legitimacy. Canadian aid should not be politicized or weaponized. Our country should also recognize and provide expertise and material support to emerging democratic governance bodies at national and subnational levels. Nobody wants Myanmar to become a failed state, least of all the people of Myanmar. As we speak, there are emerging state-level governments across the country that are creating new aspirational systems, building on the work of established ethnic governance bodies. The National Unity Government should be one of the recognized and supported bodies, provided that it commits to truly building an inclusive democracy that gives equal rights and status to Rohingyas. Canada must not abandon our commitments towards conflict-affected people from Myanmar. The country needs our friendship more than ever. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. Bringing to this discussion this morning is esteemed professor of law, John Packer, who for many years has worked in a whole range of international multilateral organizations and is one of our foremost human rights experts in Canada. John, please.
Thank you very much, Senator McPhedran. I first visited Arakan, Rakhine State in 1993 as a UN staff member investigating serious violations of human rights against the Rohingya people. That was in the shadow of the forced return from Bangladesh, the refoulement of Rohingya, of about 250,000 Rohingya who had fled in the second large exodus of Rohingya from their homelands. In August and September of 2017, a similar and much larger mass exodus of Rohingya, some 800,000 victims, caught international headlines, this time with live video circulated globally in real time. That was the fifth major exodus of Rohingya. By then, about 80 to 85% of all Rohingya, about 2 million refugees, had been forced out of their homeland, most to Bangladesh, but many others within the region, to Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, India, and beyond, notably to Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. Now, today, we are witnessing the sixth major push as a large part of the remaining 500,000 Rohingya in Arakan, Rakhine, Myanmar, have been displaced, their homes and communities destroyed, and thousands are clamoring again at the border with Bangladesh or to find any rickety ship to take them to safety abroad. Described as the most persecuted minority in the world, Rohingya have been subjected to an extraordinary and persistent litany of gross and systematic violations of human rights against these entirely innocent and non-threatening people. Scholars have labeled the ongoing genocide and persecution as a slow-burning genocide, conducted over decades and generations, systematically destroying a people who have done nothing except to exist as a distinct community in a valuable place in the northern Bay of Bengal, squeezed between competing states, unsympathetic governments, and murderous forces. Today, perhaps only 5% of Rohingya remain in their homes shaking with an all-encompassing fear while watching their lands and livelihoods be taken or destroyed and their identity denied and dismantled as they are dispersed around the world. Today, you have heard from leading young women Rohingya, articulate, educated, courageous, and manifestly competent. They are calling, they are pleading for help, as they do all within their meager resources, to help at least the women and children in refugee situations they face increasing hate, exclusion, and deprivation. In some, Rohingya face an existential threat. Their very existence as a distinct people, torn from their homeland and at pains to maintain, much less enjoy or celebrate their identity. They ask today for our recognition and political support. This should be easy to give. They also ask for concrete and material assistance to their people through them. This should also be easy to give. Indeed, evidence shows that assistance directed to and through women, focusing on education and self-help organizations, is the most effective use of resources. They also ask for accountability of the perpetrators, of the genocidal junta destroying Myanmar, and of other perpetrators specifically violating Rohingya. All this Canada can do, and surely should do, as part of a meaningful feminist foreign policy. We have the privileged position and capacity to deliver all this. We cannot hesitate to do so. The Human Rights Research and Education Center at the University of Ottawa, which I direct, fully supports this clear and compelling call to action. Thank you. Excuse me.
Thank you very much, Professor Packer. I have just returned from New York from the UN Summit on the Future and related meetings, and I really need to underscore how what Canada may be saying in international fora such as the UN and what we are not doing within the scope of this government's authority is quite evident. And so I join with the advocates today to say to the Government of Canada, get over this bad behavior that we're seeing in Parliament and focus. Focus, make decisions, use our resources, use the mandates that we already have. We have a national action plan on women, peace and security, youth, peace and security. This context is ready for more action. Let's pick up where we left off a few years ago and reignite action and resources to address the ongoing genocide of Rohingya people with a particular burden on women and children. Thank you very much, and we welcome any questions.
We will now take questions on Zoom. Nous allons maintenant prendre les questions sur Zoom. As usual, one question, one follow-up. Please use the raise hand function. S'il vous plaît, utilisez la fonction main levée. Comme à l'habitude, une question et une question de suivi. Dylan Robertson, pardon. The floor is yours.
Hi there. Thanks for taking our questions. There was an issue with the Zoom. Those of us on Zoom missed most of the press conference sound. We can catch up later, but I apologize if I'm asking about things that you had already talked about. I'm wondering about the government of Bangladesh. We know that Bob Rae in May had expressed concerns about the inability for Rohingya in the camps to be able to access work, to access education. And there was some pushback to that statement from NGOs that said, you know, you need to go around the government and fund more grassroots groups. I'm wondering if we're doing enough for the relationship with Bangladesh right now, especially given Trudeau met, I believe, yesterday with Muhammad Yunus, and the Rohingya issue wasn't even mentioned in the readout from the meeting.
I think that the current situation of the Rohingya remains uncertain, but groups like ours and many of our supporters are ready to tackle the issues and push for the new interim government to actually take a look at a more comprehensive humanitarian support, knowing that the funds and the humanitarian aid internationally available will be dwindled, and it has been dwindling. We would like to push for the new interim government to actually consider a more sustainable plan. And that plan would need to include availability and access to work, employment, and healthcare that the Rohingya community can participate in, as well as, you know, something that could be self-sustaining later on. And what this look like depends on what the new interim government allows, but we have a lot of hopes that they would actually join hands with us and join hand with many other Rohingya-led and refugee-led and other initiatives that listen and hear us. So I think that's all that we can say as of now.
Dylan, I hope you could hear that answer. I want to only add that when I was in Cox's Bazar in 2019, I then went to the parliament in Bangladesh and had meetings with very high-ranking officials very close to the then president. And one of the issues here that relates to your question are the international obligations under international human rights treaties that, for example, guarantee a right to education to children, which was something that was being denied to all of the Rohingya children in Cox's Bazar at that time. It was international pressure. It was the advocacy of civil society organizations like those represented here today by Yasmin and Noor that made the change. It is far from realized to the extent that it needs to be, but this is the kind of advocacy that governments need to be hearing, because everything said here today, all of the requests made here today, are already within the scope and the mandate of the Government of Canada. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. And just as a follow-up, just wondering about our Rohingya strategy. We had the first phase, the second phase, that expired in the spring. Ambassador Ray seemed to suggest that a third phase would be coming. I haven't heard anything. I'd like to know if any of you have heard of an actual articulated update to the strategy coming and, what that should include. I mean, I assume it's everything you've laid out today, but just if there was anything outside of that scope that you think should be in the third phase.
Mr. Packer.
Thank you for the follow-up. My understanding that the government is right now contemplating exactly a third phase or follow-up, but you're probably aware that the overwhelming majority of the substantial funding, $600 million in the last two phases, has been directed at essentially humanitarian assistance, and the great bulk of it through multilateral institutions and the Bangladeshi government. To my knowledge, and I am well involved with Rohingya representative groups around the world, but in Canada, where we have some dynamic young representatives. To my knowledge, virtually not a penny has come directly to Rohingya self-representative groups. I can say with confidence, none here in Canada have received, even though they are well involved, as you just heard from Yasmin and Noor. And I think that Canada needs to be, one of the slogans is not only to recognize, but to help Rohingya help themselves. This is a really urgent necessity. The second element is to leverage that enormous support. It's kind of astounding. As a substantial contributor, which is much appreciated, there's some hesitancy to actually point out and clearly call for, if not to demand, certain conduct, such as Senator McPhedran just mentioned, at least to respect the international obligations such as under the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is binding on Bangladesh and binding on Canada to ensure education provision, minimum safety and health, and so forth. So I believe that leveraging should be part of the new phase, together with direct support with Rohingya representative groups. Thank you.
Sam McGavin.
Thank you. I wanted to address the fact that there has not yet been an announcement. We are calling for a renewal of the strategy. And with respect to humanitarian aid, the humanitarian aid that is directing in the country that is currently working through military control channels in Naypyidaw, in the capital, is not reaching the most at need who are in the heart of the conflict zones. People who are fleeing conflict do flee away from the military junta. They do not run towards the arms of the military junta for humanitarian assistance. The best way to reach them is through local civil society who is working in the safety of bordering areas, who can channel funds and goods across borders, across all of the borders, the land borders, so as to be able to reach people who are displaced in those areas and to reach far beyond, and so that we do not shore up the legitimacy of the junta. We also feel it's very important to have support to the governing structures that are emerging there. This is a key opportunity for Canada as a federal country to help support the federal dream that's been the longstanding dream of the country's ethnic people, including Rohingya, so as to have a pluralistic, inclusive, peaceful state. Thank you.
And Noor, Azizah.
In terms of humanitarian aid, we've had an escalation of violence against Rohingya in Arakan, in Rakhine State. And because of this, we've had displacement of more than 25,000 Rohingya fleeing across the Naf River and arriving in Bangladesh. And do you know who the first responders were? Do you think it was the big NGOs, UNHCR? It was actually us, the Rohingya women, responding to more than 1,000 Rohingya families, providing them with aid, food, support, and we're seeing many women and children arriving without their husbands because their husbands are being kidnapped or killed. So we are often the first people to listen to the stories of our people fleeing the ongoing genocide. So it just highlights the important factor that Professor Packer just said, needing to support Rohingya-led organizations.
Thank you.
Thank you. This concludes the press conference. Merci.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just